Congratulations again. My name is Rebecca Tinder. I'm the West Virginia We the People Coordinator and your facilitator for Unit 4. Our judges have arrived. They will introduce themselves and then you will introduce yourselves and your teacher, and then we shall begin.
Good afternoon, Nevada. I'm Lynn Simons, and I am from the great state of Nevada. The Chief Judge of the Second Judicial District Court. I'm an ardent fan of We the People and have enjoyed kind of every level of working on it. So I'm very excited to hear your testimony. I listened to Unit 6 and enjoyed them throughout the competition all weekend. So this is a fresh look for me on Unit 4. So I'm excited to hear your testimony and your questions and answers. And as I tell every group and have, you're the 36th one I've told, take a very deep breath right now.
And breathe. Okay, so it's good to see y'all from Nevada. I'm Hank Chambers. I'm a law professor out here at the University of Richmond in Virginia. I've been doing this for about 25 years or so. So this should be fun. This will be a fun conversation, and that's really all we're here to do, is have a conversation about the Constitution and related matters. So I look forward to it, and just relax. It's the last one of the day.
My name is Joe Stewart. I teach in the Political Science Department at Clemson University. I've been instructed by our Chief Judge how to pronounce your state's name. I hope I can get Nevada right. She'll correct me if I make a mistake. But more importantly, I'm interested in hearing what you have to say. You've been studying the Constitution. I've been doing this for a long time, but I still learn something each time I do this. And so relax, we're going to have fun today, and I'm going to learn a lot from you.
Would you please introduce yourselves and your teacher?
Yes, good afternoon, judges. We are representing Reno High School's Unit 4. My name is Ethan Herrick, and this fall I plan on attending Montana State University. Right now, we are presenting from the University of Nevada.
Good afternoon, judges. I am Mia Riggs, and this fall I will be attending University of Washington.
Good afternoon, judges. My name is Kayla Snell, and I will be attending the University of Oregon.
Good afternoon, judges. My name is Sheffer Zamach, and I'll be attending the University of Texas.
Good afternoon, judges. My name is Ashton Pearson. I will be attending the University of Nevada, and our teacher and unit coach is Mr. Richard Clark.
All right. Unit 4, how have the values and principles embodied in the Constitution shaped American institutions and practices? We have chosen question 2. The president, quote, ought to communicate such papers as the public good would permit, and ought to refuse those, the disclosure of which would injure the public, quote. Do you agree or disagree that the executive can withhold or disclose information at her or his discretion? To what extent, if any, has the claim of executive privilege expanded presidential power since its inception? And are the constitutional powers that enable the other two branches to counter executive privilege claims sufficient? Why or why not? You may begin.
If ignorance is bliss, why aren't more people happy? The question posed by Thomas Jefferson in his 1816 letter to Charles Yancey curtails the legitimacy of his assertion on executive privilege. We agree, in part, with Jefferson's claim regarding executive privilege. However, we hold that the legislative and judicial branches, along with the responsible media, should decide which papers would injure the public. To retain the rule of law, essential for a democratic republic, pluralism within the release of federal information is necessary, because ignorance to knowledge is misery.
Aristotle held that no one person can create perfect law, even if they are the best of men, and that the rule of law is preferable to that of any individual. Executive privilege is an implied power under Article 2 of the Constitution. However, the president is still liable to prosecution in the ordinary course of law, retaining the rule of law and not of man, as expressed in Federalist 69.
The idea of executive privilege originated in 1794 when George Washington was asked to disclose documents relating to the Jay Treaty negotiations with England. Washington refused, arguing that public ignorance to foreign negotiations protected the common good, and he acknowledged that executive privilege must only persist as long as it is within the public interest to do so.
President Eisenhower first coined the term executive privilege. In 1954, he ordered his Secretary of Defense to deny military officials from testifying at Senator McCarthy's hearings about alleged communists, citing the need to be completely candid when providing internal advice. Eisenhower invoked executive privilege 44 times, signaling an increase in public ignorance as the executive began to overstep their separation of powers.
The overuse of executive privilege undermines the people's right to information. The media cannot effectively inform the people if executive control on information is absolute. This concept is best encapsulated when President Nixon obtained an injunction to stop publication of Pentagon Papers in 1971. The court ruled in New York Times versus United States, the First Amendment's freedom of press allowed only the press themselves to exercise prior restraint, proving that ignorance of information is not bliss.
As a response, Nixon issued Executive Order 11652, specifically outlining the standards of classification regarding government affairs readily available to the public. This reduced the number of agencies who had solicitation authority, introducing new classification standards like reasonable expectation and serious damage tests, thereby increasing public ignorance.
Executive privilege is sometimes necessary in order to maintain public confidence in our government. President Bill Clinton's executive privilege claims during Operation Uphold Democracy in 1994 were deemed legitimate in the Haitian Revolution, despite politically driven congressional subpoenas. However, his claims during the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal were rejected because the obstruction of justice outweighed the confidentiality of White House discussions, and the ensuing report was released to the public.
With the hyperpartisan state of Congress today, the most effective route is through the judicial branch. The court used its Article 3, Section 1 authority to sufficiently counter executive privilege when President Donald Trump attempted to withhold records relating to the January 6th insurrection in the 2022 case, Trump versus Thompson.
Congress can circumvent the use of executive privilege through the power of inquiry in Article 1, Section 1, because they must access executive information to carry out their constitutional duties regarding investigation. Recently, the January 6th committee filed a legal brief suggesting that President Trump may have engaged in criminal acts when attempting to overturn the 2020 election, effectively checking presidential power.
Executive privilege is a legitimate power of the president. However, it cannot be absolute and must be checked by a variety of government institutions. American writer James Cooper claimed that government is a powerful servant, but a fearful master. Executive privilege is often necessary, but it turns dangerous when the balance between blissful ignorance and an informed public is forgotten. Thank you.
Thank you. In examining executive privilege, you've identified some checks, and I'd like to explore that a bit more. Additional Congress checks. How can they keep the use of executive privilege in a place that's not inappropriate and ineffective for the common good?
Congress's power to investigate is inherently good in order to check executive privilege, and this is seen in Article 1, Section 1, Clauses 1 and 8 of the Constitution.
Additionally, Congress's subpoena power and ability to compel witness testimony and subpoena certain documents is also vital in checking executive privilege. And this was seen most recently in the January 6th insurrection and the January 6th committee, which subpoenaed documents on President Trump. And the court has affirmed this decision in their case, Eastman versus Thompson, in which they allowed Congress to subpoena specific documents on his former General John Eastman. And by doing so, they have affirmed Congress's power to subpoena, even in the modern 21st century.
In addition to congressional investigations, the courts play a huge role in checking executive privilege. And this can be seen in 2016 with the case Committee on Oversight and Government Reform versus Lynch, when the courts have to rule the competing interests at stake, whether the claim executive privilege is legitimate and if it must yield to the claim that the committee needs the documents. And in the Fast and Furious scandal, they ruled that President Barack Obama's claim executive privilege must yield to the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform's legitimate need for the documents.
let me just make sure I understand, because I thought I heard you all say in the opening that the legislative branch, the judicial branch, and the press should decide which paper should be released. If that's the case, then doesn't that mean that the president has no discretion regarding which papers to release?
The president should be able to decide which papers should be released, but in cases of national security and in other instances where our security and our right to information and knowledge is compromised, it is the legislative, judicial, and responsible media's right to check the president and check executive privilege and allow the people to be informed so they can make responsible decisions and vote responsibly in elections.
Additionally, President Obama in 2009 signed Executive Order 13526, which established a uniform system for classifying, marking, and safeguarding national security information. And this allows the president to overclassify information and then later declassify as he sees fit.
The president should have the first discretion on what information is to be released, as he is the commander-in-chief and should have jurisdiction over matters such as national security. However, Congress, the judicial branch, and the media are all reactive checks that can check an over-classification of information.
I would like to agree with my colleague and state that the president does have the power to disclose information under his Article 2, Section 2 right as commander-in-chief. And this can be seen with the Kennedy and Cuban Missile Crisis, when President Kennedy imported a naval blockade with no help of Congress and disclosed information of the missiles in Cuba from the Soviet Union, from the public and from Congress until he released that information.
How will I know responsible media when I see it?
We are
This is the
taught in
people's-
schools as the society that grew up with social media and a lot of disinformation. Whenever we do research papers in English classes and in history classes, we are taught what information to use and what information is credible. And we use this information to determine what news is credible and reliable.
At the end of the day, the government can only do so much. A responsibility falls upon the citizen to look at other avenues of information and to not rely on Facebook for sourcing most of their news information.
Additionally, in the preamble to the Constitution, the framers wrote that we, the people, must provide for the general welfare and protect the state of the Union. And in James Madison's Federalist 51, he claimed that if angels were to govern men, neither internal nor external controls would be necessary, meaning that government is not perfect, and it is the people's duty to protect and uphold government or the protections against government wrongdoings and check federal abuses through the use of media and social media.
So there's a concept of power corrupts and absolute power absolutely corrupts. If we have an executive that would fall in that absolute corruption category, does your proposal that the legislative, judicial, and the media, do they provide sufficient checks at this point to alleviate that particular situation?
In 1996, with the Supreme Court case, Clinton versus Jones, it established that the president, while in office, is liable, civilly liable, and can be sued for actions unrelated to his presidency. And this is the role that the courts play in checking executives when acting out of line.
I would disagree in part with the premise of the question, because although Congress did impeach President Donald Trump twice during his administration, the people saw to it that he was allowed to stay in office and he did not remove himself. Whereas during President Nixon's administration, he was forced to remove because of public opinion.
I would disagree with my colleague in that the media is what enabled Congress to remove President Nixon, because the media is what exposed the Pentagon Papers, which led to the Watergate scandal.
Additionally, the media has exercised restraint in and using their prior restraint to effectively determine if information should be released to the public. And this was seen in the Iran hostage crisis, in which the New York Times was asked by the president to not release information about the hostages in Iran. And the New York Times decided not to do so because it would compromise public confidence.
So you're saying that although it's not a constitutional check, that it's an effective and existing check that we have to deal with.
Yes, ma'am.
The ultimate check is us, the people, as voters. And if we think that Congress is doing a not effective job, we can vote in better representatives and senators to help investigate or possibly impeach to check the executive. And we can help to reinvest in local media that can give us better information rather than corporate national media that might be leading us astray.
You mentioned Eisenhower in your opening. Do you think Eisenhower's take on executive privilege was sensible or problematic?
A lot of the time, Eisenhower's take on executive privilege was sensible because the Committee on Un-American Activities in the House and the Senate at the time were exposing and committing to acts that went against people's Fifth Amendment right to self-incrimination. And this was seen with their hearings, which was checked by the court in the 1955 case, Bart versus United States, in which the committee effectively tried to trump President Eisenhower's executive privilege claims over those who had communist ties relating to family issues in his bureaucracy.
We see, however, that executive privilege has shifted from national security to personal interest. And this primarily started during President Nixon's administration when he attempted to cover up the Watergate scandal, in which he and his administration were illegally active. And therefore, since then, distrust in the government has been allowed to thrive, as well as executive privilege claims that protect personal interests and not the national security and betterment of our nation.
One of the defenses for executive privilege is that it promotes candor in executive advice. Are there other ways that we can promote candor in the advice the president gets? Can you think of any?
Yes, the court has outlined other ways that we can promote this. And this was done in the 1997 case, in the resealed case on the former president or former Secretary of Agriculture, Mike Espy, in which the court determined that the presidential communications privilege allows for those in close proximity with the president to be able to deliberate and have free discussions. And through an in-camera review, the court to determine the appropriate limits on executive privilege, both deliberative process and presidential communications.
Mike,
one example of this.
Oh, go ahead.
One example of this would be the Presidential Records Act, which dictates that all records from the White House be kept secret for a minimum of 5 years, which helps to keep these hidden from the public until later, but ensures that eventually they will be released so that those can be held accountable.
So Mike Espy was a Secretary of Agriculture. Is there any reason to believe that the information that he kept quiet was related to national security?
Since he has close deliberations, may I please continue?
Sure, go for it.
Since he has close deliberations and close proximity with the president, he could have been a part of deliberations in terms of national security, because although he may not be related to certain matters, he is still one of the president's top advisors and still has deliberations with the president about his personal interests or interests of national security.
Thank you.
Well done. I enjoyed your presentation really a lot. It's hard to navigate a 5-person team, and I think you did it really well, particularly on Zoom. What I think is really interesting is you brought in a perspective we haven't heard. And in my mind, and it was the media portion, and it was almost as if this is a necessary evil. I mean, I'm not saying that they're evil, but so we're just going to embrace it instead of, pushing back. And I thought that was a really interesting viewpoint. You also have, you had a wealth of examples and case law. And I was checking to make sure that you met the call of the question. And you did. I was looking for on the checking with legislators power of the purse or budgetary confinements. But well done. I really enjoyed it. And you should be very proud of your presentation.
Yeah, I agree. I thought you did a very good job. I very much enjoyed our discussion. To add to Judge Simon's comment, just because you focused in on this particular question, don't forget other things that I'm sure you know about American government. That Congress has the power of the purse, that the Senate has power to confirm appointees, and perhaps withholding that confirmation would be a way that you could get the president to help negotiate. I admire your optimism. I got the response about when I asked about how do I know responsible media, you told me about the good training you've gotten to identify responsible media. I wish I could send everybody to your school where they would get that training, because I see a lot of evidence that not everyone can identify responsible media. But I too enjoyed the addition of that to the discussion. I think you're probably correct. We do need to take that into account. And I will think about that some more in terms of how well we can use that as a check on presidential privilege. But thank you very much for a worthwhile discussion. Very much enjoyed it.
Absolutely. You all took the notion that the Constitution is a living and breathing document that we can breathe into quite literally. And I think the positions you took were really interesting. I suspect that some folks might normally jump on y'all and say, hey, once the public and the judiciary and the press know what's in documents, the game is up. Because once they know it's in documents, then executive privilege is already lost. But I think y'all are probably doing something a little more nuanced than that, and maybe talking about the press and the judiciary and the legislature defining the general outlines of the information that should be released, as opposed to the particular documents that should be released. I like the fact that you noted that with President Clinton in Haiti, that executive privilege was allowed, but with President Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, it was not, because it's important to see that sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't at the same time. So in the grand scheme of things, I think it was a good conversation. I'm not at all surprised that we had a good conversation, and I wish it could have gone on longer. But I hope that all is well with y'all in Nevada, and that you all have had a great tournament, because making it to this final day, great stuff. And we'll see where your final position is tomorrow. So good work and congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judge.